The really awesome thing about astronomy is you only need a pair of eyeballs to really enjoy it. You just have to go out to some dark skies and you'll be able to see galaxies, our galaxy, nebulae, stars, and a whole bunch of things that will totally blow your mind. If your eyeballs aren't enough for you, you can expand to a cheap telescope and see distant galaxies, distant nebulae, hundreds of deep sky objects, and many other things. But what happens when you decide to go down the rabbit hole and start astrophotography? You're going to find yourself paying thousands of dollars for cameras, telescopes, guiding equipment, specialized tracking mounts in order to capture photographs of the night sky. All of these different things add up very quickly, but what do they actually get you in terms of your photos? How do these photos compare to professional photos from space observatories around the world? I've been doing astrophotography for a little over 10 years and professional astrophotography for a little over 1 year. So I've used a whole range of telescopes all the way from the most basic to the most advanced that you can get. So in this video, we're going to be answering the question, what can you see with a $1,000 telescope, a $30,000 telescope, and a $100,000 telescope? So before we dive too deep into all the technical information, I have to give you guys an analogy so you understand what the point of a telescope is and how it works. Using a telescope for astrophotography is literally the same thing as using a bucket to collect rain. The wider the bucket, the more rain you're going to get in a shorter amount of time. And that's the goal. What we want to do is use our telescopes to collect as many photons from distant nebulae and galaxies in space as quickly as possible. The quicker we can do it, the better the photos we're going to actually get using our telescope. But this analogy does fall kind of short of the nuance of astrophotography. A telescope is merely a tool for the job. Just like how a portrait photographer may choose from a whole slew of lenses to accomplish a goal, a telescope in astrophotography is the same way. We need to use specific telescopes for specific goals, and just because one is bigger does not necessarily make it better at a specific goal. Likewise, you wouldn't want to use a jackhammer to do brain surgery. You wouldn't want to use a wide field telescope with no zoom to photograph a really tiny galaxy. It's just not going to work. So a telescope is a complex instrument, and bigger doesn't always equal better, but most of the time it does. So to start this video off, we're going to talk about the first astrophotography telescope I ever owned. This little 80mm refractor, the Orion ED80T CF. And I'm going to be honest with you, I did kind of fudge the numbers just so the title of the video sounded better, because the whole setup to make this telescope work in reality costs more than $1,000. You need to have a tracking mount, which cost me $1,000, and you need to have a camera, which cost me about $900. And then some kind of a guiding system, which will run you about $500. So in reality, it's a little bit more, but I think you get the picture. So this is a refractor style telescope, which means it uses lenses instead of mirrors to collect and focus the light onto the imaging plane. What this means is that typically it's going to be very small in size because it's quite expensive to produce large refractor telescopes. But as I said earlier, this is quite okay because it's not always about how big the telescope is, it's about how we use it and what we're using it for. In this case, a small little 80mm refractor telescope like this can actually show you a whole host of things in the night sky that are truly amazing. So to start off, to show you what you can capture with just a simple $1,000 telescope, I'm stealing this idea I saw from another YouTuber. His name's Dan Scotting, where he talked and showed his images in front of a projector, and I thought it was really cool, so I'm doing that here now. If you want to see his videos, check in the description. I'll link to some of his, because I thought the idea was really nice. Anyways, what you're seeing here is something that you might not expect to be such a good result for a $1,000 telescope, and one with not much zoom either. What this is the Horsehead Nebula and the Flame Nebula. Now these are some very bright and very faint nebulae in the constellation Orion. They're quite large in the night sky, which makes them quite an apt target for a small telescope with not much zoom to it. Now I did use a special camera with some special filters to help bring everything out, but this is something that could be feasible to shoot with even an introductory camera. This is, just something that suits a small telescope quite well. Now it's not just nebulae and galaxies that you can see with a small cheap telescope. You can also foreseeably take some pretty nice moon photos as well. so long as you know what you're doing with your camera and you're stacking to get the clearest images possible and higher signal to noise, then you can bring out some faint details on the moon like this, even with a more modest telescope. I'm trying to find a photo that shows how bad this telescope can be in certain contexts, but it's proving difficult. Again, here's another great example for what a small budget telescope can do. This is the California Nebula, shot in narrowband, so it does have some special colors and it does require special filters, but again, this thing is huge in the night sky, so it suits very perfectly a nice, cheap, small telescope. Well, no, I have a lack of shitty photos. All these photos are good. All right, finally, here is an example that kind of shows the shortcomings of this telescope for being so small and cheap, which is when you try and look at galaxies that are very far away and very tiny, it doesn't work very well. Obviously, if we took the big telescope and tried to point it at all those things that were huge and massive in the night sky, it wouldn't have been possible. So you can see where it's a different tool for a different job, and it doesn't make it worse. It just makes it worse at certain tasks. And this is one of the tasks where the $1,000 telescope just isn't up to it. It simply doesn't have enough reach to touch out and see small galaxies like this, which is M106. Any of these smaller galaxies are just way too tiny and not visually interesting. So that is the shortcoming of the $1,000 telescope. What can we see with a $30,000 telescope? All right, let's kick things up a notch. This is my $30,000 astrophotography system, and this uses a very fancy Takahashi FSQ 106 EDX3 telescope with a Moonlight Nightcrawler focuser rotator, a Paramount ME, a little guide system, a computer. Everything all in all is about $30K, and this was essentially my no expenses spared astrophotography system. But how does this compare to the $1,000 telescope? You might be surprised to find out that this larger, more expensive telescope actually has less zoom than my first telescope. It is a wider field of view system. You can think of a portrait lens versus a bit more of a wide angle landscape lens. This one provides a little bit more of the wide angle landscape as opposed to the zoom, which may be counterintuitive because you would assume a bigger, more expensive telescope is going to have more zoom, right? But that is not always the case for what's better for astrophotography. So I'm going to take you back to the rain bucket analogy. The rain bucket that my last telescope I showed is 80 millimeters in diameter. This rain bucket is 106 millimeters in diameter. This gives it effectively almost twice the light collecting area as my 80 millimeter refractor, which is great for collecting lots of light from space quickly, which is the most important part. And not only this, because it has less zoom than my 80 millimeter refractor, that actually compounds upon that effect, making it capture light even more quickly since it's more intense on the imaging plane. Now, all of this comes together to make this telescope collect light about 3 times faster than my 80 millimeter refractor, which opens up a whole world of possibilities for the types of images you can create, given that you could do it in 1/3 of the time. It opens up so many creative possibilities for unique photos and even discovering new objects. So with the $30,000 telescope, the one I own actually, like I said, has less zoom than my $1,000 telescope. But with this extra zoom, it means you have some flexibility with your ability to collect light quickly, which gives you a huge advantage to do lots of really cool things. Like such, this is the nebula that I discovered using my own telescope, the $30,000 telescope. And because of the nature of the scope, given how fast it is at collecting light, the advantage is it allows me to look and find for things that are super ultra faint. Things that would have taken me hundreds of hours on the other telescope suddenly become within reach for this more expensive telescope for objects like this. Now this is FALS Object 1. It's a large oxygen-3 emission nebula in the constellation Monoceros, and it's actually about the same size. Projector. Anyways, the projector won't show up, but this nebula is almost as well, it's slightly larger than even the full moon is in the night sky. So I'll show you some other examples of this capability that the extra money gets you. And really the capability is just all about saving time. So this image here,
is one I also shot with a $30,000 telescope. This is a discovery made by my friends, Marcel, Yan, and Xavier, that I had the opportunity to work on. And this is the O3 Andromeda Arc and I think they're calling it the Blue Tarantula. It's still something that's being researched, but again, more undiscovered nebulae. This took 110 hours of exposure time in the Oxygen 3 filter. So just imagine doing that with my $1,000 telescope. Would have taken me 300 hours. It would have been a multi-year effort to shoot this with my first telescope versus doing it with this telescope. It can be done in the course of a week or a month. So this extra speed or ability to collect light doesn't only need to be used for looking for new things. You can also use it to capture huge panoramas that could only be possible in certain amounts of time. Something like this image, which is a 25 panel mosaic spanning pretty much from Sagittarius all the way to Serpens, the Lagoon Nebula, the Trifid Nebula, the Eagle and Omega Nebula, and a whole bunch of stuff in between at very high resolution. This image is over 1 billion pixels in size and with quite a lot of detail, captured in a relatively short amount of time, only about 35 hours. Again, something like this, an image like this, you're super strapped for how much time you actually have, and doing it with the $1,000 telescope, really not practical in a short amount of time, but doing it with a telescope like this, again, it becomes a real feasible image that you could take. This photo is basically the epitome of impossible and strapped for time. This is again another panorama, but this time shot in narrowband. Took over 80 hours of exposure time, and put in context with the other telescope, again, like over 200 hours of exposure, and simply would not be possible to get all of this in a short amount of time. There was another important distinction though, something I need to mention that happened between getting my first telescope and using this more expensive one. And that is that I moved my telescope to a place where it's permanently installed and I don't have to set it up every night. This is something that's even more of an important factor to me than buying a more expensive telescope. Obviously, because if you buy a telescope and you don't use the telescope, it's effectively not a good telescope because you're not using it to collect light. And if you're wasting light, then what was the point of the expensive telescope? So the important distinction also that happened between those scopes is that this was moved to Sierra Remote Observatory. It's a remote observatory where the scope lives permanently, and I use it pretty much every single night, and where it's clear and the skies are dark all the time. So this gives an added time efficiency advantage that is not really tangible when you only consider the telescopes used. The $30,000 telescope gives you the power of time efficiency is really the best part of it. And the time efficiency allows for newer possibilities that are more interesting in terms of the things you can compose in a panorama or the faintness of the thing you can see. That's the true advantage of the time. But what do you gain with getting a getting a $100,000 telescope?
All right, now we are moving into the big boy, the $100,000 telescope. What can this see? Now, I have to be honest with you guys, I don't have enough money to pay for a $100,000 telescope, so this one I don't actually own. This is owned by my friend Keith Quattrochi, the owner of Sierra Remote Observatory. He has more important things to attend to than running a telescope every night. So I oversee this instrument and I make sure that it's operating to its fullest potential all the time to help showcase the quality of the skies where it's at. So that's how I have access to an instrument of this nature. Otherwise, I would not be able to do it. So big thanks to Keith and to SRO for having access to this instrument to allow you guys to see what an expensive instrument like this can actually look at. If we go back to our light bucket analogy, this light bucket is vastly different than the other light buckets. This one has over 15 times the area of my last biggest telescope. So you would think 15 times the area, is gonna give us so much light so much quicker, right? That actually isn't the case. While it does have 15 times the area, this telescope has serious zoom. And when a telescope has this much zoom or focal length, the light is less intense when it gets to the imaging sensor. Now, because of this, it actually collects light 6 times more slowly than my Takahashi does. But there's a trade-off. The trade-off is the 16-inch telescope has over 10 times as much resolution as the Takahashi. This means there is a whole host of new things we can see with it that would basically be out of the question for the wide-angle telescopes.
And it's a bit interesting. The $100,000 telescope is better at some things, but it's worse in other things. But it does give you one very important thing that none of these other telescopes have, which is reach, or pure resolving power. And I'll give you some very good examples of this. So here is an image I actually just finished with the $100,000 telescope, the 16-inch Arcos at Sierra Remote Observatory, and this is Messier 100, the Pinwheel Galaxy, Messier 101, sorry. And if you're looking at this as it is on the projector, it's probably visually indistinguishable from a Hubble photo. That's the advantage, is there is over 10 times as much resolution as the $30,000 telescope. So the ability to get up close and see these small galaxies is something that's simply not possible with the cheaper telescopes. You need the size and the reach to be able to do it. So let me show you an even more cropped in version of this. Here you might even be able to see a lot more detail. Again, to me, this literally just looks like a Hubble photo, so it's pretty impressive. Now you can see where this might be a problem. If we're going for small faint things, or large faint things, this telescope is actually pretty slow at collecting light because it's extended so far in its reach, which means it can't do things like the Andromeda Arc. It can't do things like the large faint objects, but the small ones, it kind of blows the smaller telescopes out of the water. And I'll give you some more examples of this. But here's another great example. This is the Sombrero Galaxy. I actually have shot this with my very first telescope that I owned, and it's not visually impressive with 400 millimeters of focal length, but with almost 4,000, it gets very interesting. I can even show you a more close crop. Again, on the projector photo, you probably can't even tell the difference between this and the Hubble image of it. The extra reach is the power. Will I see things like the faint tidal loop around the Sombrero Galaxy? No, probably not. The faint tidal loop is quite a bit too faint for this telescope, but again, this is good for the reach. Here's another good benchmark object. This is Bode's Galaxy M81. Again, very tiny on any of my telescopes, but once you get the extra reach, all of a sudden you can see all the nebula, the dust arms. My other telescopes can see the integrated flux nebula around this galaxy, but they can't resolve as much detail, and that's what you get. But again, you can see it is a trade-off. There's a trade-off between speed, time efficiency, being able to capture wide fields of view, and trading that time efficiency for resolution and reach. Both have a valid role in taking photos of things in the night sky. You know, sometimes you're going to want to use the small blade to do the brain surgery, and sometimes you're going to want to use the jackhammer to bust up the foundation. You know, there's different tools for different jobs. In astrophotography, you pick the right tool for the right job. I'm even going to give you a very weird example that I probably should have mentioned in the video, but it's just going to be a fun little addendum to everything, and that is that I also use, one of my favorite tools to use is actually a camera lens, a $500 camera lens with pretty much a fifth of the zoom of my cheapest telescope, but it can still accomplish some pretty visually interesting things. This image would pretty much take me like a year to shoot with any of my other systems, but by using a cheap 135mm camera lens, all of a sudden I can see a whole bunch of stuff at once. And this is the Milky Way core, the narrowband continuum. This basically means I'm looking at the hydrogen and oxygen gases emphasized over natural view over this huge swath of sky, which again would just take me an unimaginable amount of time with any of my other telescopes that have a ton of zoom. And again, this kind of goes back to the part where we're trading resolution for efficiency in time and field of view. So this is optimized for exactly this kind of job, but would suck for the galaxies. Well, that's my whole video about the differences between a $1,000 telescope, a $30,000 telescope, and a $100,000 telescope. The main takeaway I want you to get from this is that maybe what you're paying for when you get a more expensive telescope is purely that it's larger,
but that isn't always necessarily the best thing depending on the goal you have in mind. Sometimes a cheaper telescope can be better than a more expensive one at a different goal. It's a different tool for a different job. So it's an important thing to keep in mind, but expensive telescopes can be found for any goal. So there's no limit to how much you really can spend if you want to spend a lot. But if you're looking for just telescope recommendations, I have some recommendations in the description of this video. You can check there if you're just looking to get a beginner telescope and start looking at the night sky. Again, you could always just use your eyes, but a telescope and a camera is a little bit nicer. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to help support the channel, again, the telescope link's in the description. I've also got fine art prints of my work on my website, a number of workshops coming up this summer if you want to come learn astrophotography in person. It's a great time. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and found it useful. I will catch you all in the next one.